So it was only about, I think, like half again of whatever there was in class. I will try and get us ahead of the game again, as we have with the other text, but I didn't want to try and do that on this text and the other text at the same time because you'd have been completely overwhelmed, I think, with video watching. It will send you crazy. So we'll just keep plodding through this until we've got a little bit more slack in the other text. So, scene 3, it's pitch darkness again, and I think the sense of darkness, I think, a lot of the time is this connotation of the connection with the Dionysian in this play. This play in many ways is a really convenient follow-on from Death in Venice because the intellectual context is so clearly connected. The relationship between the ideas in that text and this one are really direct. Aben comes in from the left and goes around to the porch, feeling his way, chuckling bitterly and cursing half aloud to himself. So much of the description of Aben is, and particularly when we get to the moments in the play where him and Abby's relationship starts to kind of trigger, I think takes away the kind of conscious element in his decision making.
So if he's looking at the sky, connects him to the motherly emotional background, let's say, then the fact that it's now pitch dark and that he can't see the sky, does that connect him to Ephraim?
I'm tempted to draw a diagram again, but let's not. Think about it this way. The elms and the stones are like these two symbols of these two competing dynamics. And I think the sky is the source, the place where he invokes an ability to transcend that conflict, somewhere that isn't involved in this competing dynamic of the kind of Dionysian chaos of the maternal vitality of the elms and then that sort of Apollonian rigidity of the stones and Ephraim and all of his sort of religious theology. The sky is that, in that kind of Freudian conceptualization, it would be the ego, the thing, the site of reconciliation between these competing impulses. And in this sort of Nietzschean conception, it's somewhere where you are outside of that competing dynamic and you are able to kind of extricate yourself from those forces. And of course, no one does in this play. They just continually invoke it. And I think that's part of its overall sort of aesthetic of fatalism, is that you can't really get yourself out of those forces, but you can look at it and sort of long for that sense of sort of kind of tranquil transcendence out of this competing dynamic. That what you see in the play is basically these two forces kind of colliding repeatedly through all the characters. But the characters themselves in this way, I think it's part of what I don't find extremely kind of convincing about the play itself, is that they seem like vehicles, the characters in this play, for these big ideas rather than fully kind of formed three-dimensional humans. And I think that's where I would say this is not as good as either of these other two plays. I was going to say who has the Nobel Prize, but Pinter does as well now. But Tennessee Williams doesn't. I think Tennessee Williams is sort of the best playwright out of all of them, to be honest. But this I think is very heavily about ideas. The play itself is about intellectual ideas, and those characters, I just think, have limitations in terms of their sort of conceptualization. I look at characters like Aben, and I find him a vehicle for a series of ideas rather than a human being, and Ephraim as well. It might just partly because of the distance in the context, but I find it difficult to connect with either of them in a way that's sort of convincingly human. They have two sides. They have flaws and they have strengths, both of them, and all that kind of thing. But they both seem so sort of extreme in terms of their connection to these sort of Nietzschean conceptions that they seem like the vehicle. They seem almost allegorical in a sense. They seem like the kind of embodiment of ideas rather than actual three-dimensional human beings. Aben is cursing half aloud to himself, and he is very heavily in his own world a lot of the time. He is in his own world, driven by these kind of fatalistic forces, and feeling his way, not through his eyesight, not through his conscious control, not through his logical vision, but through his impulsive kind of awareness of the surroundings. And then he calls Ephraim the cussed old miser. He can be heard going to the front door. There's a pause as he goes upstairs and a loud knock at the bedroom door of the brothers, and he just shouts, "Wake up!" So there's this, lack of warmth in his communication with the brothers that shows the lack of connection between them. They are kind of at least partly related by blood, but they are so distant from one another, they're so alienated from one another, Aben and Simeon and Peter. And I think it's interesting that Simeon and Peter have these very biblical names, and Aben himself doesn't necessarily have a biblical name, but he has one of the names that you would associate with kind of Puritan New England. A little further down, he pushes the door open, a lighted candle in his hand. The bedroom of the brothers is unrevealed, and its ceiling is the sloping roof. They can stand upright only close to the centre dividing the wall of the stairs. So the setting itself, it seems claustrophobic, and I think, again, there's an obvious comparison with a birthday party in the stagecraft in this play. That's what I always imagine that you're doing when you're looking at this. It's tilting your head. It's a claustrophobic room, and there's, I think, a connection between the setting and the insularity of Ephraim's kind of repressive model of parenthood. He's kind of piling up this sort of fortress-like wall in the house and with the stones that also finds its equivalent in the rooms themselves. Aben's cot is in the rear, and it's interesting that it's called that because I think it infantilizes him, and there's a number of repetitions of that throughout the play that he is infantilized, and I think it feeds into that Oedipal conception of his relationship with Abby eventually. Aben has a mixture of silly grin and vicious scowl on his face, and I think this stage directions like this that tell us everything that we need to know about his personality, that he's vengeful and infantilized and seems at that moment in time to be a product of both of his parents. He's got this kind of vengeful anger at the same time as he's got this light-hearted kind of silly grin on his face, and that internal conflict that he has and doesn't realise. This is the key kind of irony in this play, particularly at the opening, is that he thinks he's Alma, as he calls her, but he so clearly borrows many of the features of his father. He has many similarities with Ephraim and doesn't really fully realise that. He then has a little conversation with them. What in the hell's fire? And he says, I've got news for you. Couldn't you hold it till we got to sleep? It's nigh sunup, and then explosively, he's gone and married again. And Simeon and Peter explosively ask the question. So you see, I think in that mutual explosive response, the way all of them are kind of materialistic and covetous, that they immediately detect a threat to their material interests and their potential gain as brothers of the farm, and they all react in that same way. So even though that we see, again, this is where the language and the actions in all of these plays, I think, have different levels of honesty about them. That Simeon and Peter have this sort of explosive threat here, and so does Aben. And they're supposed to be, in their heads, they think of themselves as being so different, but all of them have this sense of covetous materialism, I think, that they so clearly inherit from their father, whether it's through nature or nurture. They definitely have borrowed it from him in some way. And then Aben says, he got himself hitched to a female about 35, and purdy, they says. So there's this immediately, that's just a weird thing to talk about, I think, from the perspective of all of your sons. The first thing you register about your dad's new wife is how attractive she is. And so there's this Oedipal emphasis that there's sexual rivalry right at the conception of their relationship. There's this sense of possible sexual rivalry. And then Simeon, it's a darn lie. They've been stringing you. Both of them are inclined to kind of side with the simplicity of Ephraim's vision of life and his story. Their inclination is to side with Ephraim because it involves not thinking. It involves just doing what they're told and being good kind of, good religious boys, in the way that their father has communicated to them. You're inclined to do this because it involves not thinking. I want me to move sideways a little bit. So I'm right in the way of this little screen. Video is going to be fun. He says, "Think I'm a dunce, do you? The whole village says." I can't do this accent to save my life, and I back myself as quite a strong accent performer, but this one I just have no idea about. The preacher from New Dover, he brung the news, told it to our preacher New Dover. That's what the old loon got himself hitched. That's where the woman lived. So I think the important thing here is that he invokes this kind of religious figure to gain their trust. He deliberately invokes this preacher figure to get them to take it seriously. So I think he quite early on in the play, has this fairly strong kind of manipulative ability that you see in Abby as well. Abby has this sort of manipulative talent when she arrives on the scene. And Peter, no longer doubting, immediately, he mentions a preacher and then immediately says, okay, yeah, I believe you. Wow! His little outburst. His trust is completely engineered by Aben's sort of invocation of religiosity. He then says, sitting down on a bed with vicious hatred, ain't he a devil of hell? It's just to spite us, the damned old mule. So the intensity of their kind of material claim is what initially allows them to kind of connect with each other in this particular moment. They connect with each other because of their shared interest in the ranch and its material wealth. Peter, after a pause, then says, everything will go to her now. And then there's that stupid noise that they make continually throughout the play. Hey, well, if it's done, it's done. So they quickly Simeon and Peter get over it pretty quickly. They are very quickly reconciled to the nature of this. And I think don't have then the same sort of instinctive hostility that you see in Aben. Aben burns with kind of anger and hostility towards this particular issue. And then Peter says, it's done us, and there's gold in them fields of California, Sim. No good of staying here now. So immediately, their entirety of their family connection, this is what it says here, is based upon a kind of a transaction of money and an inheritance. They immediately say, well, there's no point in us staying here now because he's found this wife. And it exposes completely the sense in which the entire reason for them staying here is to just cling on and hope for control of the ranch. They want control of the farm. And then, obviously, the fields of California thing begins again. Simeon says, just what I was thinking. Then with decision, swell first last. Whatever that means. Let's light out and get this morning. Suits me. You must like walking, Aben says. So there's a kind of a sort of synchronized mindlessness, I think, between Simeon and Peter that you see all the way throughout the play. They act on autopilot like the cows. They are not that distinctive from the cows themselves, and they just behave in this kind of completely vacant, thoughtless way. They just connect to each other instinctively and respond instinctively to all of these threats.
So could you link this, because basically, even though they're mindless, their kind of subconscious goal is simply power.
Yeah.
So could you link that to the birthday party?
Absolutely. Their initial situation at the beginning of this play is really nothing more than power. And who gains control of the farm is the issue of power. The interesting thing here is that there's no real victim. There's no real victim. The only victim in the play itself fully realized is the child that's born, the child that ends up being killed. And so we have this kind of, you could say, but I think even then it's complicated whether you call him that or not. The conclusion of the play leaves him lonely. And it is clear from when you read O'Neill's descriptions of this text, the way he talks about it is that it is an indictment of Ephraim's way of life, his kind of religious commitments, his rigidity and all these concepts. So, if there is someone, I guess, that supposedly loses, it's him. But, we can't necessarily say that Abby and Aben win. They both get taken off to prison. They both end up going off to the jail. And it says...
In the other mirrors, or could be a parallel to Stanley, and how Goldberg would take him, to bring him back to orthodoxy. And Aben and Abby going to jail, maybe that's how they're brought back to orthodoxy, or they're brought back to avoiding the taboo relation that they engaged in, and the fact that they murdered the child.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I think their regulation by an institution of power is again another possible connection.
In the case of Aben,
yeah.
Very unlawful in the case of
Stanley. But that's good. That's a good contrast between them. And then again with Blanche too. All of them end up with this sort of being abducted by the representatives of institutionalized power. And that there is varying degrees of conscious control involved in them. But, both of them end up being taken away because of the taboo nature of their relationship, and then their act of murder that is, results in, it's resolved in an act of murder. A little further down, Aben says, it says for $300 to each, you agree your shares of the farm is sold to me. So he's trying again to manipulate them, but purely here by taking advantage of their interest in money. He is fully aware here that their single and central interest is in material power, and that's what he uses to try and gain control over them. And then the stage directions here tell you everything you need to know about the contrast between the brothers. Simeon is wonderingly talking about if he's married again, and then Aben is cunning. The contrast between them is constantly kind of mediated through these different stage directions. And it's very clear that Simeon and Peter are supposed to be these kind of mindless morons. They don't really think critically about anything. And then he talks about Ma. Ma told me. He invokes her again. She knew where it lay for years, but she was waiting. It's her, the money he hoarded from her farm and hid from Ma. It's my money by rights now. So there's a real blend here. That money in him represents his sort of maternal claim and a power over the ranch. And that's an important kind of conflation, because we sort of associate in the play the feminine vitality of his connection with his mother, with the Dionysian, and then also with a kind of principled behavior that he seems to be enacting. But here, that's how he blends the two together. He's managed to convince himself that his greed and his monetary claims over the ranch, his thing that he inherits from his father, are actually connected to the maternal. They are the same thing.
Is that historic kind of like Oedipus thing?
In what way?
In the way that, in the case of Oedipus, it was like unconscious, it was not his mother, but there's like a connection of some sort to the mother and a will to destroy connection with the father.
Absolutely. He consciously. The interesting thing here is the mixture of his motivations. There's 100% a conscious identification with the maternal and the mother, that he represents her continuation and that he identifies with her completely, and that he frames that in terms of his rivalry with the father. That's a kind of classic Oedipal complex. But the interesting thing here is that he's invoking his commitment to the maternal through materialism, and there's a blending there of both of them. If you think of the stones as being a frame and his greed and his money and the mother being the feminine, the vital, all of those things. Well, he's blending the two together here. He's saying to him, that it's her money that he hoarded from her farm and hid from Ma. It's my money by rights now. So his materialism and his connection to the maternal come together in that claim. And so there's this, I think, confusion on his part, the confusion that Abby ends up separating from his mind. Abby ends up basically dragging him away from the aggressive kind of materialism that he's inherited from his father. And that's where the full connection with the sort of Oedipus complex comes in, is that he ends by sort of losing this sense of covetousness. And that's, I think, supposedly the victory. The victory is that their life is compromised. Their life is awful that they're going to go and lead, but they are in love with each other in some bizarre way. And that he has forgotten about money and the ranch and control and power and all of those things. And so there's this, her function in the play is basically to loosen his similarities with his father. She distances him from that. And that's where the Oedipal structure of their relationship comes from. So again, he's cunning. He's cunning all the time. He's cunning, but kind of a little bit dumb. I'm always surprised that he manages to maneuver the characters in a way that he does, because he's not particularly subtle about it. He's no Iago, let's tell us that, Ma spied on him, or she'd have never known. A pause, and they look at him suspiciously. So there's this huge desire for vengeance, and I think that is communicated through his knowledge of the mother. The mother knew that she was being tricked, according to him, and that's what drives his vengeance. She knew when she was alive that Ephraim was swindling her out of money and kind of ruining her life in some way, destroying her material well-being. And then, if ever you needed a kind of prompt for identifying both of them as clueless, there it is in front of you. Dunno. Both of them at the same time. Synchronized idiocy. They literally have no thought themselves, and they are indistinguishable from one another in their language. And then they can't deal with this thought. Looking at the window, the sky's grey, and you better start the fire, Aben, and fix some victuals. Some victuals, I think, is the word that he is supposed to be saying there, some food. So they fall back when they're confronted with this unpleasant truth about how vicious Ephraim is in the beginning. They fall back on the sort of the rhythm of life on the ranch to avoid thinking. That's really all they're trying to do. They're doing the classic evasion of critical thought because they don't want their conception of reality to be disturbed. And Aben, I hate this. I really dislike this. I really dislike this feature of the text itself. Got a little phone call on the YouTube videos. Hello. Yes. I do. He can. Sure thing. It's something like the institutional leaves of power. No, it's by the school nurse. They need to check your arm. It's McCann Goldberg. Don't say anything because you're being recorded. So, he then has a forced jocular heartiness. He's consciously making himself cheerful. I'll get you a good one if you starting to hoof it to California. You'll need something that will stick to your ribs. So he tries here to kind of disarm them with a bit of geniality. And again, there's that sort of the warning about friendly language in all of these plays. When people are being nice to you, very often they're not. They have sinister intent. And he does this here. I'm going to cook you a great breakfast so that you will get lost and naff off to California. He wants them to leave. And so this forced jocular heartiness is fake. You can see that he's performing kindness to them. It's not real. So he tries to kind of disarm them with gentility. He tries to show them that, if they go away, everything will be good. He turns to the door, adding, meaningly.
Just as much as McCann and Goldberg tried to mask their sinister intentions in the birthday party.
Yeah, I feel like they do a lot better job of it than him, though. He's so, exploding with rage all the time that he doesn't do a particularly fantastic job of shrouding his intentions.
Yeah, but Peter and Simon
are so dumb.
Exactly.
That's what's kind of interesting about this is that he's not very good. He's not a very good, character actor. He can't hide his intentions particularly well. But they're so stupid that they don't realise that he's sort of having really to badly act, basically. He's having to force himself to pretend here, and they don't even see. He stops at the door and pauses. And I think he sort of believes that their temptation will work here. He's waiting for their response. And then they stare at him, but they are suspicious. Where was you all night? And then he defiantly says, up to Min's, which obviously is sleeping with a prostitute. And so, here, it doesn't say it directly. It never says 100% that she's a prostitute, but I think the amount of times that they talk about her and then I've used her, he's used her, they've used her, and I think there's a mention of it being something to do with money at some point in time that we can work out that I think is the case. But he kind of concocts this plan whilst kind of formulating this explicit rivalry with Ephraim at this moment in time. So he is sort of concocting this plan at this moment in time when he feels this intense sexual rivalry with his father. He's really unhappy when he finds out that his dad has also slept with this prostitute. It sends him into a kind of blind rage. And so, you can see that there's this extreme Oedipal element, and it doesn't even matter whether it's with the mother. It's actually just any woman together. There's this sexual rivalry between father and son. And he first felt if I'd kiss her, then I got a thinking of what you'd said, a him and her, and I says I'll bust a nose for that. So he starts, that line there is him explaining his plan and his desire for revenge on her. He's talking about punching this woman in the face purely because she slept with his father. But then I got to the village and heard the news, and I got madder in hell and run all the way to Min's, not knowing what I'd do. So he, in this kind of blind rage, just runs into the arms of this prostitute and doesn't really know why. Well, then I seen her, I didn't hit her, nor did I kiss another. I began to bellow like a calf and cuss at the same time. I was so darn mad and she got scared and I just grabbed hold and took her. He's bragging here about being violent with her. Yes, sirree, I took her. She may have been his'n and your'n too, but she's mine now. So we look at this bizarre, this is totally bizarre, this what he's talking about here. And I think there's all sorts of different potential comparisons that sort of spiral out of this bit of dialogue here. That there's something really childlike, I think, about what he says here that's really disturbing for the sinister violence that it contains. You know, there's the sexual violence and domineering behaviour that he demonstrates here obviously has a direct similarity to Stanley's in the birthday part. In Streetcar, Stanley Kowalski. But there's definitely, you know, Stanley is a lot more menacing, I think, than him. You know, he seems like a confused little child. But there's also something extremely dangerous about this type of thinking. You know, the state of his mind here really reminds me of how I imagine these people that commit these great acts of atrocity are. You know, they're young, they're filled with rage, and at the same time as they make these sort of misguided understandings about sort of dominating other groups of individuals. You know, you look at this and he's imagining here beating up a woman purely because of this bizarre subconscious sexual rivalry that he has with his father. And that there's something really infantile about his rage there. And that he ends up talking, you know, he doesn't know what he's talking about here. I begin to bellow like a calf and cuss at the same time. He feels compelled in a way that he doesn't understand. So again, that fatalism in his behavior, forced by the dynamic of sexual dynamism that draws attention to the connection with Stanley, is another reason why he seems so confused. I think his lack of understanding is another way of invoking the concept of the Dionysian in the play. You know, he doesn't really get it because he's driven by forces beyond his control. And then he proudly talks about dominating her sexually. I just grabbed Holt and took her. Proudly, yes sirree, I took her. She may have been his'n and your'n too, but she's mine now. And so she becomes this site of competition, of one-upmanship and of domination that I think, you know, is a very clear connection to Stanley in Streetcar. A little further down, they talk here about her. What do I care for her, excepting she's round and warm? The point is she was his'n and now she belongs to me. So here, he explicitly articulates the fact that he doesn't really find her attractive or care for her in any way. It's purely the sexual rivalry with his father that motivates his passion for Min. You know, Min is this kind of surrogate maternal figure that fulfills that function until Abby turns up and provides it for him. He goes to the door and then turns rebelliously. And Min ain't such a bad un. There's worse than Min in the world, I bet you. Wait till we see this cow the old man's hitched her. So this, I think, prefigures his kind of lonely connection with the cows. You know, it immediately talks about, I think it uses that motif of Ephraim's connection with the cows here to isolate him and to talk about his loneliness, to represent his sense of loneliness. You know, that's why he's so fascinated by the cows, is because they are sort of warm and natural and vital, but they're not human beings. So it's a kind of a sort of bastardized Dionysian that he ends up formulating with the cows. You know, this play's so weird. He's getting some kind of sense of Dionysian chaotic sexual vitality in the barn with the cows. You know, you think, Jesus, where are we going here? You know, this play takes you to such strange places. Yeah, you know, we're only in Act 1, Scene 3, and we're already talking about him experiencing sexual vitality with a group of cows. He spits in disgust. There's constantly spitting the characters in this play, and I think, you know, there's that sense of like there it is like Blanche's bathing. You know, there's this kind of sense of disgust at the stones and the hardness of the rock, and it's almost like they're kind of attempting to cleanse it or fertilize it in some way all the time when they constantly spit on the floor. I think, you know, it's partly we'll call it the hillbilly aesthetic that O'Neill is going for here. You know, There's this kind of, I imagine them chewing tobacco and having the little pipe and, carrying on in that kind of voice. But I think it is, that it's so repetitive that I think it is a significant motif in the text. And it spits with disgust. And this, I think, is an example of the foreshadowing, the proleptic irony. The justification is the same as his attraction to Min. So he says, here, her here sleeping with him, stealing my Ma's farm. I'd as soon pet a skunk or kiss a snake. He goes out and the two stare after him suspiciously. So here, when he says, I'd soon pet a skunk or kiss a snake, we see this bizarre sort of inversion almost of what actually happens. He, of course, is pretty quick to work out that he finds Abby sexually attractive. The scene when they first encounter each other is horrifically kind of tense from sexual perspective. It's, they're entirely lacking in control of each other, and themselves. They cannot help themselves. They're like compelled by these powerful forces of desire beyond their control towards each other. And here, this is deliberately set up, as a moment of, I think, deluded hubris, that I'd soon pet a skunk or kiss a snake. And then they look after him in the sense they keep watching as he strides off. They're suspicious of this. They identify, I think, a moment of insincerity in what he's saying, because obviously what he spent the previous whole page doing is invoking his aggressive sexual rivalry with his own father. That's what he spent the entirety of this section of the text doing. So they look at him and say, well, I think maybe you would, actually, Sunshine. I think you might. I think from what we've inferred here from your treatment of this poor prostitute, that you would quite willingly try and sleep with your father's wife. It feels like you're descending into a really bizarre kind of piece of pornography. It's terrifying.
There's a moment of slight clarity and...
Yeah, I think there is a moment of... I wouldn't call it understanding, because it is just suspicion. They think there's something a bit fishy going on with his conduct.
Moment of a light bulb.
Yeah, a little brief possibility of a thought from Simeon and Peter. Now, maybe it's a lie, they say. They sort of give him the benefit of the doubt here. They kind of want to believe that it's not true. And don't sign nothing till we does, nor till we've tested its good money. Then with a grin, but if Mars hitched, we'd be selling Abe in something we'd never get anyhow. So there's this sense here, I think, of their kind of mutual trickery of him through money and through power that has this, this series of possible connections between the play and a birthday party. They think that they're tricking him by selling him something that they'd never get anyway. So they think they're selling him a dud, basically. That if there is this woman, then they're not going to inherit the farm anyway. So of course, I'm going to take $300 or whatever it is that he offers them in the end, I can't remember, for their share of the farm. And so when he talks about this over here, I think there's this sense of injustice at the fact that there's this, that the field is the product of their lifetime of tough labor, and that's what they invoke here. He says, until he comes, let's you and me not work a lick. And it's sudden vindictive anger that he delivers these lines with. So there's this real sense of anger about the way that they have basically poured their entire life and existence into this farm and into this ranch without really getting anything in return for it. They've basically been human fertilizer for the ranch, and they actually use that particular metaphor later on in the play. Until he comes, let's you and me not work a lick, and let Aben tend to things if he's a mind to. Let us just sleep and eat and drink liquor and let the whole damned farm go to blazes. And you look at this, sounds a bit bizarre to be talking about fancy linguistic techniques, polysyndeton that he uses here, and this. There's almost, I think, a sense of a sort of explosive excitement. They're like a couple of little kids, little repressed kids being let off the leash here. Let's just sleep and drink and not do any work. They have this moment of real sort of explosive excitement that seems completely at odds with the sort of vengeful anger that Aben is demonstrating at this moment in time. He's all simmering with rage, running around like a kind of a wild animal, burning up inside. And they're thinking, well, sell him $300 for this bit of the farm that we're not going to get anyway, and while we're doing that, we'll sit on our butt and get drunk. Of course, later on, the little kind of or respecters of authority that they are, they end up kind of wussing out on this little promise. They pretend they're going to be rebellious, but in the end they decide against and end up kind of doing things as Ephraim comes back. And he's excited, Simeon here. By God, we've earned a rest. You know, they're pleased here. We'll play rich for a change. I ain't going to stir out of bed till breakfast's ready. So here he's kind of coming out from this moment of repression, and this is what we mean by the Apollonian in this text. It's extremely repressive, harsh, self-abnegation that Ephraim enforces on these characters. And there's this moment here of they're like a couple of rebellious teenagers just suddenly realizing that, hey, we can go get drunk and no one's going to do anything to us because we've just sold this dud kind of license for rights on this farm to our brother that we don't even like anyway. So who cares whether we muck it up? We don't have any claim over it. But importantly, what it shows us is how the whole facade of cooperation in this family is being held up by the issue of their material inheritance. You know, as soon as they realize here that they possibly have no material claim over the farm itself, that all of their commitment to it goes out the window. You know, at least in their head at this moment in time, they say, you know, screw it. We're not going to do anything. I'm not doing anything if I'm not going to inherit it myself. And so they're, you know, it shows us how distant and inauthentic their connection is. And I think that's one of the kind of central potential comparisons between this and the birthday party, is just how distant and alienated all of these characters are from each other. You know, their whole family is held together by nothing more than a kind of a patrilineal claim for material wealth. That's it. That's the only thing that is holding them together. And you can so see O'Neill's life in this. There's an O'Neill documentary on YouTube I watched the other night where I was sitting with it annotating. It's the most depressing thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Don't watch it unless you are like high on life, because it will literally crush your spirit. It is so depressing. His life story is horrendous. It is just one horror after another. And he had this really awful relationship with his dad that was traumatized by his dad's sort of materialism, his dad's obsession with money. And you can see this so heavily in this moment in the play, where this entire family hates. You know, they hate each other basically. They really deeply resent each other and have very little authentic connection with each other in any way at all. And all that you see in this moment in time is this kind of angry hostility. And as soon as that material facade comes crumbling down, all of their resentment and alienation is brought to the surface in a much more direct and aggressive way than you see in the birthday party. But I think that's one of the main sources of comparison between this and Pinter particularly, that the characters have almost no connection with each other whatsoever, other than through violent kind of contestation and disagreement. And so here...
Well, just as much as in Streetcar 2.
Yeah, I think...
They're interconnected through the animalistic and social hierarchy that dictates the new American way of life.
Yeah.
And Blanche is distant from that. Also alienates her from the alienation that's created within the social hierarchy.
Yeah, one of the main things that within that's slightly different is that in Streetcar you have these moments where human connection seems possible. You know, you have that moment with Mitch and Blanche, you know, where it seems plausible that there may be this possible connection between people. And I think... Yeah, and I think it's the Abby-Aben relationship really is the only thing I think in this play that sort of seems to make a connection. But I think later on in the play where Ephraim drops his guard and confesses all of where his beliefs come from later on in Act 2, that moment there's a potential there for Abby to connect with him and listen to what he's saying. But it's that moment where the stage has you look at the set and Aben is in one room and then her and Ephraim are in the other, and Ephraim is kind of pouring out his heart to her, and all she's doing in the stage directions is like having this sort of animal sexual connection with Aben through the wall, as if they're sort of deeply connected with each other in a way that's sort of beyond their own understanding. So there's that potential moment of connection with Ephraim there that just breaks down because of her sort of compulsion towards Aben, which I think is just like that moment with kind of Blanche and Mitch, where there's this sort of potential connection between lonely and isolated, vulnerable individuals, much like Ephraim is the lonely, isolated, vulnerable individual in this play. And that the forces beyond their control, that animal passion, is ultimately what drags people away from them And it's the characters in both of these plays that can't engage with that sort of sexual dynamism that end up alienated and alone. Blanche ends up alienated and alone because she can't connect with that sort of animal physicality and vitality that Stanley represents. Ephraim ends up alone and spends his whole life alone because he cannot connect in any way to that sense of kind of passionate vitality.
Sorry, what is that last word there? Faith?
Here.
When
Well,
it says resentment there, something justified.
Falsely justified repression. So here, they're both vindictive and fervent, and it's interesting here that he uses this religious vocabulary in the stage directions, fervent spiritual belief at the moment when they say amen. And then there's this suggestion here where he says, wow, I hope she's a she-devil that will make him wish he was dead and living in the pit of hell for comfort. And so there's this bizarre combination of puritanical religiosity in their language and vengefulness that is part of O'Neill's critique here. O'Neill associates puritanical Christianity with the Apollonian rigidity of Ephraim. And that here, this is what it leads to, this angry sense of vengeance, because you have crushed people's spirit, basically. You've spent your whole life crushing their spirit, teaching them to mistrust their sort of darker human impulses, and prevented them from engaging with a sense of vitality in the deep driving impulses of life itself, because of your commitment to this repressive kind of theology. And so here, that sense of combination is played out in their language, and he, at this moment, is then fervent and says, amen, as if they're saying a prayer. That this is sacred language in this play, this violent desire for his father's marriage to be completely doomed. And so we get this very strong critique about the consequences of this repressive kind of puritanical existence that Ephraim has forced upon them. The final lines, they imitate his father's voice. I'm riding out to learn God's message to me in the spring like the prophets done. He says, I'll be right then and there. He knew plumb well he was going whoring, the old stinking hypocrite. So here, they are completely angry about the fact that he has justified their repression, that they've suffered all the way through their life and their childhood and into their adulthood on a theological basis, and then he's kind of exposed himself to be a sinner, and they can't tolerate the hypocrisy here. And again, that brings, I think, an interesting possible connection with Blanche, and her kind of feigned sexual sort of chastity and purity. That Ephraim's pretense is ultimately what creates this vengeance in the brothers. And then, Blanche's pretense is what cultivates that pretense, that vengeance in Stanley. He can't tolerate her false airs of kind of pure religious conduct and pure sexual religious conduct. So there's a number of different things going on at this moment in time. But that I think is what's particularly interesting about this play, is that the way in which when you think back to Thomas Mann and the things that he associates with the Apollonian, and it's sort of artistry that he associates with the Apollonian, of conscious control, of rigidity, that is based on a vision of some of the artistic life. But here, it's about puritanical religion and the repression, but all of it is this kind of stuff that's resident within the mind mistrusting or distrusting the impulses of the body, and not really being able to engage in that kind of vital, because if you think about it, really, might stop recording here.